Hi everyone, I'm Bhante Sujato and I'm coming here to talk to you today during this conference of Buddhism in the time of COVID. I hope that you're all well. I hope that you're all coping with the social isolation. It's not an easy time for anyone, but we pull together and at the very least we have the Dhamma to give us some guidance and give us some light. So thanks so much to Deepika and to Damit and Radha and to all of the organisers of this event and all of the participants. It's been a great honour and a great privilege for me to be invited to speak to you all. I wish we could speak in person. It's always much nicer that way, but at least we can try to do this much. Now, in my last little talk that I gave, I talked about the three Buddhist characteristics of impermanent suffering and not self. For this talk, I'd like to approach it a little bit differently and look at it from the story of Rapunzel. You know Rapunzel, right? Rapunzel is the young girl who is trapped in a tower by the old witch. And when the witch comes to visit her, she lets down her long golden hair. The witch climbs up to the tower to see her. After some time, the handsome prince hears her singing, comes by. Of course, they fall in love. She lets him up into her room, and they decide to run away together. He's going to come back for her the next night. However, when the witch comes to visit her that day, she lets it slip. Oh, my dress is feeling a bit tight today. And she knows what the young girl's been up to. And it's always the way, isn't it, right? Teenagers think that they're getting away with things, but somehow the parents are not quite as naive as the teenagers would like to imagine. Anyhow, Rapunzel's pregnant. And so the witch, so incensed by what she has done, expels her, throws her out, expels her, and she goes off and wanders in the desert. That night, the prince comes back, sees the golden hair hanging down from the tower, as always, and climbs up, fully expecting to see the beautiful young maiden in her bedchamber, only to be confronted by the old witch. Well, that was a disappointment for the poor old prince, let me tell you. He falls out the window, lands in a bush of thorns, and has his eyes scratched out. Again, for any young men who've been in similar situations, climbing into the bedrooms of young women at night time, then they may well have ended up in a similar circumstance. He too wanders off desolate and alone until he hears Rapunzel's singing off in the distance. He recognises the beautiful sound of her voice, and their lovers are reunited. When she sees the sad state of his scarred face, she lets fall 2 tears, and those 2 tears land on his eyes and heal them. His sight restored, the lovers marry, and they set up a kingdom. And the kingdom that the prince comes from is the kingdom of Corona. That's kind of weird, isn't it? Well, at least in the Disney version, apparently it's Corona. I don't know if that's a traditional name. I think they probably just made it up for the Disney story. But anyway, it's rather kind of evocative. In storytelling, it doesn't really matter what the truth of it is or where something comes from. What matters is what kind of response that it calls for or asks for. And, well, clearly there's a lot of parallels between the story of someone like Rapunzel and what we're all going through today. We too find ourselves trapped in a home, trapped in a place that we can't get out of, longing for escape. So what I'm going to do for this talk is reflect a little bit about this story and to consider some of the dimensions of meaning that we can look for in the story itself. Now, this particular story is one of a genre of stories that feature young women locked up and isolated in rooms. Such stories are quite common in India, and there's several of them that feature in the Buddhist Jataka stories. I've written at length on one of those stories, which is the story of Bhadda Kundalakesa, and you can see my book Dreams of Bhadda for like a fictionalized retelling of her life, and my book White Bones, Red Rock, Black Snakes, which looks at the symbolism and mythology around that story. But I'm not going to get too much into the details in this little talk here. I'm just going to sort of look at a few of the different aspects of the story. Now, is there any connection between those Indian stories and this story of Rapunzel? Well, it's hard to say. Rapunzel, the story, does have roots in mythology, but the version that we have was a fairly recent composition. It seems that the story may have, one of the aspects of the story is harks back to a solar goddess. Rapunzel with her golden hair is like the dawn in the tower, and the solar goddess of the dawn is Aruni, is one of the major deities of the Vedic mythology. So it could well be that in some senses she draws upon that particular set of symbols and ideas. And if we look at it from that way, we could see that she, Rapunzel, the maiden, represents the dawn, the witch represents the night, or perhaps Rapunzel represents the springtime and the witch represents the winter, the death of winter. And so this is kind of cyclical mythic storytelling, which of course reflects the fact that the witch was once a young maiden, and the maiden will be an old woman in her time as well. These things are not completely separate, so mythic storytelling is always cyclical. When we hear about these stories which are told in these cycles like this, what's the point of it is that it places our human experience within the experience of nature. Their story of aging and death and stages of life and all of those things, that story is a part of the cycles of nature. And so they might as well be either nature itself or human actors playing a role within that. Now, as human actors, there are much more straightforward comparisons to be made with social circumstances, especially social circumstances endured by young women and women of all ages, in fact. It's still, unfortunately, very common in the world for women to be isolated, to not have freedom of movement, to be virtually imprisoned in their homes. It has traditionally been very common, today less so, but still happens, that young girls are cloistered at the time of their first menstruation, and sometimes, depending on the particular culture, it might be in subsequent periods as well. And so these periods of enforced isolation for young girls and for women create a certain kind of they're reflected in storytelling and culture by these stories which often were passed down among women and often will encode certain kinds of experiences which are things that can't be comfortably talked about in public. As well as reflecting that cloistered experience of women, these stories reflect the kinds of dangers and threats which women face. In my studies of mythology, I've compared the hero myth with the story of the woman who's trapped in the home. In the hero myth, the hero leaves the home, goes into the wilderness, overcomes a monster or the dangers, wins a prize and comes back home. And stories like, say, the life of the Buddha follow that pattern. The women's story in folktale and mythology, typically she doesn't go out into the wilderness to win a victory, she stays at home. And the monster that she overcomes is the monster in her home. The classic version of that being, say, Beauty and the Beast. Another version, very horrific version, being, say, Bluebeard. And in those cases, the husband, as the brute or the monster or the beast, poses an immediate threat to the life of the wife, every bit as dangerous, in fact, much more dangerous than the threat of being killed by monsters in the wilderness. To talk about domestic violence, to talk about the suffering that women are undergoing in the home is never an easy topic to bring up. Even today, it's very hard for us to discuss it, and it remains hidden throughout all of our communities. It was even more like that in the past, and so women told these stories of ways of communicating these realities that they've been experiencing. Women are under danger not only from the threat of physical violence from their husband, but also through pregnancy, childbearing, which were traditionally, or in the past, have been extremely dangerous for a woman's life. Still are today, obviously, but with modern medicine, much less so, thank goodness. So these are some of the dangers which are encoded in this kind of life of a woman or a young girl who's trapped in the home. And of course, this is the reality for women today in this coronavirus pandemic, that many of them are trapped inside with the beast. Women are not... Women who are victims of domestic violence are not passive in that circumstance. They don't just simply endure it without doing anything. Typically, women in those kinds of situations develop kinds of strategies to help them to minimise the harm that they suffer, to appease. Let's say the husband gets angry when he's drunk, or when he comes home from gambling or something like that. And so they develop various strategies of avoidance and coping to try to minimise the harm that the husband does to her and to the children. During this time of pandemic, then all of those coping strategies fall apart, and women are trapped and exposed in a much greater degree than they were before, during the time when very often their husbands may be out of work, maybe they're suffering financial pressures and all the various anxieties that we're all going through due to this pandemic. And you know, the sad reality is that a certain proportion of men, and not a small proportion, won't cope with those things very well. And so we need to look to these things in terms of helping men to learn how to cope with their emotions better, but also initially, and as a first point, of helping to protect women. And the first step in being able to protect women in these circumstances is simply to acknowledge that this is a reality that's happening. And so I want to speak now to any women who are listening, who are suffering domestic violence or at risk of domestic violence. And I want you to know that it's not your fault. I want you to know that you don't have to go through this. Sometimes in Buddhism, we have this feeling that we should just have equanimity, we should just let go, we shouldn't try to control things. That's not the right approach for this circumstance. If you're at risk of domestic violence, please, I beg you, please try to do something to stop it. Contact your local authorities, talk to your neighbours, talk to your family, whatever that you can do. I know that it's hard, and I know that it's sometimes really difficult to be able to do these things. But I'm begging you, please try to find help. And you know that there are many people out there, myself and so many people who respect you and who just want you to be safe and just want you to feel that you are loved and you're worthy and that you don't deserve that kind of treatment. So if you are in that kind of situation and you're watching this, please, I beg you, please, let others help you. Now, if we look at the story of Rapunzel, it's a slightly different story. She's not at direct risk of the husband. In fact, her husband is the one who saves her. She's at risk from the witch, who in this story is something like a parental figure. And of course, this shows another reality of families, especially when people are trapped together, that it's not just the wife who might be vulnerable and might be a victim, but also the children. And during this time when families are trapped together, again, the sad reality is that many children are exposed to child abuse, whether sexual abuse or violence or psychological abuse. And so I want everybody just to be aware of this, to look out for each other, to notice it if it's happening in your family, to notice it if it's happening in your friends or your relatives, and to try to do something to protect them. In the story of Rapunzel, the protector and the saviour comes in the form of the handsome prince. In our day, the protector and saviour might come in the form of, in extreme cases, the police or the relevant authorities, perhaps a word from the neighbour or something like that. But just remember that the children are very vulnerable and we have to look after them. We've decided in our society that we need to stop the threat of child abuse, but we still think of child abuse as being something that's done by a stranger danger. The reality is most child abuse happens in the home. In the story of Rapunzel, she's saved by the handsome prince, and sometimes that's the reality too. Sometimes the husband isn't the bad guy in the story, he's the one who rescues her and keeps her safe from the abusive family. This also is a reality. But one final thing that I would like to talk about here is that the things that we need to help us get through this are not the skills of the hero, wielding swords and killing monsters. The skills practiced by the woman in the home, the skills of weaving, the seamstress, cooking. These humble and simple skills, these are the things that will get us by. There's a meme going around that says that in the apocalypse we expected that there'd be butchery, and in fact there's baking. And that's really nice. The skills of the domestic skills, the skills of the hearth and the home are the skills that keep humanity alive every day. And they're the skills that we need to learn. We forget about these things. We take them for granted. But as time goes on, these crises are not going to go away. They're going to keep on coming back again and again and again. And these kinds of skills are going to be essential for us to survive. Just to wrap up this talk for this evening, I just wanted to say that one of the messages of that story of Rapunzel and the story of the girl isolated in the tower is that this kind of isolation is never absolute. In reality, we have that connection with each other. And no matter how much we try to enforce that isolation, somehow we find a way to connect. Our reality, our human reality, is that we're not beautiful young maidens in towers. We're not wicked old crones. We're not handsome princes. We're somehow a mix of all of those kinds of things. We all have that humanity inside ourselves. And it's by recognizing that common humanity and by responding to that in creative and meaningful ways that we will support each other to be safe and to be well, to get through this crisis and to get through the next one and the one after that. So I all wish you, may you be happy, and I wish you to be well, and I wish you to stay safe during these hard times.